Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and yes, that's right, folks. We're back. We're back with the Truth Attack. And, well, where are we? Okay, we are the Liberty Works Radio Network, and we do need the support of the members of the listening audience to keep the broadcast network operating. So, if you enjoy the information, the lectures, the discussions, the topics, the revelations, the guests, and the hosts on the other shows on the network, we sure would appreciate it if you could find your way over to the LibertyWorksRadioNetwork.com website, if you're not already there listening online, and get signed up as a subscribing member. Even if it's as little as $10, $15 a month, every membership helps, and we do need the support of the listening audience to keep the broadcast network operating. And if you want to get fully informed on my favorite topic, which of course is the maladministration of the federal income tax by the IRS, the DOJ, and the lower federal courts, which has been allowed for some reason for over 60 years by the Supreme Court, well, then you want to find your way over to taxfreedom.com and start reading. And if you know anyone that needs help in answering IRS correspondence or dealing with the Department of Justice in court, you want to send them over to irszoom.com, where I have a document template library mounted that answers any piece of correspondence you receive from the IRS for $30, $40, or $50 per letter, no retainer needed. And of course, I have the documents there to answer the DOJ in court to try and compel them to address the matter of subject matter jurisdiction, which has been taken away from the government by the Supreme Court's decision in Moore et al. Last year in June, which I've been discussing since last September, because it puts the writing on the wall. What the IRS and the DOJ have been doing to the American people since since 1955, but with force since the early 60s, is a complete and total constitutional fraud. It is a complete and total constitutional fraud. The United States government has been enforcing the income tax, claiming it's a new power to tax directly and without limitation the individual people under authority of the 16th Amendment. It's a direct tax under the 16th Amendment that cannot be avoided, and that's why they're allowed to tax gross income, is because it's a direct tax on all sources of all persons in the 50 states. And that's what they have been arguing as the constitutional basis for 50 years. And it's a complete and total constitutional fraud. The Supreme Court said in Brushaber versus Union Pacific Railroad in the original Supreme Court decision in 1916, and again, they have reaffirmed what they originally wrote in Moore et al. A year ago in 2024, when they wrote, income taxes are indirect taxes under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. Indirect. It's not a direct tax. What the government's been doing for 60 years is a complete and total fraud. You don't owe money because you work. That's not a legitimate legal or constitutional basis for the taxation by imposts, duty, or excise under Article 1, Section 8. And that's all there is under Article 1, Section 8. There is no fourth power to tax income. There is no new power under the 16th Amendment to tax directly and without limitation the revenue of the citizens. The federal government has no territorial jurisdiction in the 50 states to tax labor, and they have no legislative jurisdiction in the 50 states because impost taxes foreign persons, and that's the extent of the jurisdiction they have in the 50 states. They can tax foreign persons in the 50 states, which, as I've been explaining for the last 2 weeks, is exactly what the Congress did in 1913 when they enacted the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act of October 3rd, 1913, which is the original income tax legislation. It's a tariff act. A tariff is one form of an impost which taxes foreign activity. And what the Tariff Act did is it imposed a tax on all foreign persons in the 50 states and on all persons in the territories and the possessions, where the federal government does have the territorial jurisdiction and the legislative jurisdiction to write law, and where every person in the territory is subject to taxation by virtue of the privilege enjoyed by being allowed to earn money there and protected by the United States government, where theoretically the cavalry will ride in at the last minute and save you from the Indians, right? So they have the authority to lay that sort of tax in the territories. It's not a direct tax on all revenue, it's an indirect tax, an impost taxing foreign activity. In the 50 states, it's imposed not on citizens, but on foreign persons and foreign corporations, but it's not paid directly by them. It's paid through a scheme of taxation of indirect collection of the tax at the source. The Supreme Court tells us that it's a collected tax. It's indirect. And how is it collected? It's collected by the corporations, etc., who are given the duty to retain and pay the sum of the tax as tax collectors. So they turn over what they collect. So the key to understanding how the system really works is to examine who the collectors are allowed, authorized, and required to collect tax from. And we do that, we find they're only collecting tax from foreign persons in the 50 states. Now, the really neat thing about this is that the duty of the corporations, etc., to retain and pay, we, the American people, are in that sentence. We're the etc. who were given the role in this scheme of indirect collection of the tax at the source. We're given the role of the sovereign power, that of the tax collector. Citizens, like the corporations, are given a duty to withhold money as tax from payments made to non-resident alien individuals and foreign corporations. The role of the citizen in the original income tax legislation is as a tax collector, unless he's earning money in the possessions or a foreign country under tax treaty, which is where Section 61 came from, a Canadian tax treaty signed 5 years later in 1918. The original sources of taxable income were 1441B. It's the same list of items as is in Section 61 practically, except it includes wages and salaries when earned by a non-resident alien individual as identified in 1441A. So that was the original list of sources, as those earned by foreign persons under 1441B. 5 years later, they added the Canadian tax treaty, which lasted for 75 years, and Section 61 was enacted under that treaty. It was enacted at the time as Section 22A, and all of this is reflected in the 1939 Code. In 1954, they recodified the law, and in reorganizing it under the recodification, 22A was moved to Section 61. At which point, in 1955, 1 year after the recodification in 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Commissioner v. Glenshaw Glass that Section 61 was Congress acting to enact legislation that taxed all accessions to wealth. All of a sudden, Section 61, after recodification, is no longer connected to or limited by the Canadian tax treaty that it was enacted under. All of a sudden, the Supreme Court says this is domestic legislation. Now, this is the same Supreme Court that gave us Korematsu, which says it's okay to intern all the Japanese without due process or cause. It's the Supreme Court that gave us Social Security. It's okay to tax labor. This is all the liberal decisions. It's basically the same court that gave us Roe v. Wade and Chevron. All these liberal decisions that have moved the balance of power from we the people as collectors to the people being treated as indentured servants who are ruled by the government and can be enslaved by them if the government chooses, because all it has to do is raise the rate of tax to 90%, right? 95%. Now you work all day and you take home virtually nothing, become totally dependent upon the government for food, shelter, transportation, energy, recreation, virtually everything. Clothing, heat, cooling. So does the government have the power to tax you directly and without limitation at whatever level they want in a non-uniform manner, which of course is what graduated taxation does? It's non-uniform class legislation that breaks the American people and keeps them politically at war with one another, rather than focusing on the fact that it's the political class that's looting the treasury and engineering the class warfare in the streets through the class legislation it enacts that treats the people differently through different rates of tax, and thus keeps us as a divided people, with each side of the division constantly calling out to the federal government to step in and assume more power. To end the class warfare, it is engineering in order to assume more power. And of course, being able to tax directly lets them reach into your wallet to steal as much as they want to fund their boondoggles and world global rule agenda. And Chevron let them make up their own regulations to apply and enforce the tax as a direct tax through liability established under regulations rather than any in statute. Because the only liability in statute is that of the tax collector, the withholding agents, the corporations, etc., with the duty to retain and pay. And it's indirect because those tax collectors never pay tax out of their own pocket. The burden is shifted through the withholding of money as tax from payments made to other people. But instead of paying the other people, they segregate a portion of the funds and withhold their money as tax, which they send to the Treasury. It doesn't cost them a dime. They don't pay money out of their own pocket. They only turn over what they've collected as tax from other people, just like a store turns over tax, sales tax, that it has collected from other people. But the store doesn't pay the sales tax itself. Tax isn't imposed that way. It's imposed as a rate of tax on purchases that are collected at the store, who's made liable for the payment to the state treasury of the tax collected. And you have exactly the same scheme in the federal income tax. It's a rate of tax imposed on constitutionally federally taxable earnings derived from impost activity, impost duty and excise activity and transactions subject to those forms of taxation under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. It's not a direct tax on all revenues, unless you're in Canada under the treaty between 1918 and 1993 when it expired. I think Section 61 is dead letter law. The original legislation expired, and when that happens, all statutes enacted under that original legislation also expire, unless, in the interim, they were reenacted by Congress with a greater applicability at law than that provided by the original legislation, which never happened with Section 61. The greater applicability at law that came about under Section 61 after World War II, because previous to World War II and the 1939 statutes, it was 22A that applied only to a Canadian tax treaty. But the greater application came out not out of Congress's making Section 61 applicable as domestic law, but out of the Supreme Court's judicial legislation in Glenshaw Glass. That was the Supreme Court, the liberal Supreme Court, that gave us all of these liberal decisions that had moved us down the road to socialism 50% of the way. Because, of course, when the bureaucracy can reach into your pocket and steal as much as they want to fund their own agenda through regulations while violating the statutes of Congress, God only knows where you end up. Oh, look, here's where you end up. You end up with a communist system of revenue raising that feeds not the Treasury, but the Federal Reserve Bank, instead of a constitutional system of indirect taxation of we the people. That's where you end up, is with despots ruling you with tyrannical lies about their authority. Okay, we'll be back in 5. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network, and let's just get right back into this. As I was saying, the income tax was a foreign tax, both the original legislation for the tax itself and the original legislation for Section 61, which, as I've said, was turned into basically domestic legislation by the Supreme Court in 1955 in Glenshaw Glass. And then the courts kind of beat around the bush for 25 years, allowing it to be enforced by the government as a direct tax based on gross income without ever actually asserting it as a direct tax, just focusing on the gross income and the taxation of all accessions to wealth as declared by the Supreme Court. So the court didn't actually say it was direct, they just inferred it by saying it reached all accessions to wealth in the 50 states. And by that maladministration of Section 61 outside of the Canadian tax treaty it was limited to, it became a direct tax in operational practice, but not in holding precedent or statute. So the operational practice, as I say, was administered from 55 to about 1980. And up until that point, some cases were won by citizens in front of honest judges who accepted proper arguments about the law. It's being misapplied outside of the ATF, Title 27, Part 70, enforcement applicability that all the enforcement statutes are published under, because of course the enforcement all goes back to the Prohibition era when all the enforcement statutes were written and authorized for use under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 to enforce the excise taxation of ATF business and the illegal ATF Act business occurring under Prohibition. So through 55 through 80, it wasn't fixed. And some judges were still holding you couldn't do that if properly argued in only a few cases and only in front of a few certain judges, of course. And in 1980, that is when the circuit courts, the U.S. Circuit Courts of Appeals, began formalizing the operational practice in their opinions, which then became the invoked precedent in all tax cases in that circuit, in district court trials, both civil and criminal, in that circuit. And those cases are well known to most folks. It's Collins in the 10th Circuit, R.E. Beckrith in the 9th, Broughton and Lavelle in the 8th, and so it goes. Each circuit has its own precedent, and all the circuit courts and all the district courts point to the circuit court decision, and all the circuit court decisions proclaim that in Bruchaber, the court said it's a non-apportioned direct tax under the 16th Amendment, which of course is exactly the opposite of what the court held in Bruchaber. In Bruchaber, the court ruled it's an indirect tax. It's not a new power. It's not a direct tax. It's not under the 16th Amendment. It's under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, and always has been, since income of corporations was taxed and from the 1860s forward, when they had the first income tax. As the court notes in Moore, during the Civil War, under the head of impost duty and excise, is indirect right from the beginning. 16th Amendment creates no new taxes. It's operated and enforced for the most part correctly up until World War II in 1942, when you get the victory tax, which is the first time federal taxing powers actually touched the labor of the American people in the 50 states. It was, of course, unconstitutional. It was direct, but they got away with it because of the emergency circumstances of the war, and it terminated after 2 years at the end of 1944. So when nobody had complained, the government wrote a new tax law, the current tax law that we're under, Subtitle C, which allows for the withholding of federal taxes where it's requested. and Social Security taxes are imposed, and federal unemployment taxes imposed, and the railroad taxes imposed. But you know what's not reimposed? No income tax. Victory tax isn't reimposed. You're just supposed to assume the tax on your labor goes to the legislation in 1913, or the victory tax, whatever they could get the people to believe in 1945. You're just supposed to assume it. And all it really does, all the law, it doesn't impose a tax on you. It lets you ask your employer to deduct tax from your wages. It allows the Social Security tax by providing your Social Security number. The unemployment tax doesn't reach you. That's an additional tax put on the employer as an excise under the code that he has to add to the 6.5% of your salary that he has to add for Social Security. He has to add another 6.25% for federal unemployment. So he's got to add 12.5%, which means you're employing you doesn't cost him 100% of your salary. It costs him 112.5%. 6.25%, 2 times. And then, of course, there's 6.25% that's withheld from your pay that's segregated for Social Security. And then income tax. Single and zero, married and two, whatever you put down, it equates to a withholding allowance, a request for your employer to withhold a tax that cannot exist under the Constitution, because that's a direct tax on your labor. And labor of citizens in the 50 states is outside the territorial and legislative jurisdiction of the federal government unless you ask your employer to withhold tax from you. And the fact that you have misunderstood and misapplied the income tax laws as though they were a direct tax, well, ignorance of the law is no excuse. Once you allow the withholding, you create the appearance of subjectivity, and based on that appearance and perception, they make you a slave for the rest of your life by stealing the money from your pay before it's put on your paycheck, and then passing it right over to the Federal Reserve Bank to service the $37 trillion in debt Congress has illegally run out, because that's where the money goes. That's why there's no record of your paying tax on January 10th after your employers sent in all the year's withholdings, making the last quarterly payment December 31st or January 1st or January 2nd, whatever date they send in that last quarterly payment. All the years withheld taxes are supposed to have been paid into and recorded at the Treasury as having been paid by you. But lo and behold, there's no record at the Treasury of any tax at all having been paid by any employee in the country. How is that possible? Title 26, Section 7809 specifically says every penny collected for tax has to be deposited in the Treasury on a daily basis. Regulations modify the daily requirement to some regular cycle, and most employers send in their taxes quarterly. So at the last day of the quarter, December 31, they send in all the taxes withheld for October, November, December. All the other quarters were paid at the end of each of them, so every penny of tax taken from your paycheck should be recorded at the Treasury as tax paid. So why do you have to file? All the tax has been paid. You only have to file if you want a refund. You don't have to file to make a disclosure of everything else you did in the 50 states. Rent, interest, dividend, wages, salaries, alimony, commissions, tips, compensation, all of those things listed in Section 61, taxable under the Canadian Tax Treaty. None of those things are taxable to the federal government in the 50 states. What's the basis for them taxing rent? They don't have territorial jurisdiction. They can't write legislation for your rent, your house, or your earnings, or your revenue, or your income. There's no direct tax. Impost, duty, and excise don't reach rent, interest, dividends, commissions, alimony, tips, wages, compensation. They don't reach. And they're not a basis for indirect taxation by impost, duty, or excise. Impost tax is foreign activity, not domestic, not citizens. Duties tax exports, not domestic, not citizens. Excises tax commodities, ATF, fuels. They tax licenses and the corporate privilege. They don't tax rights. They don't tax labor. Labor is specifically removed from subjectivity to taxation by excise by Title 15, Section 17, which says the labor of a human being is not a commodity or article of commerce, and therefore isn't subject to federal taxation by excise. And since it's domestic and not being exported, it can't be subject to duty. And since it's in the 50 states, not by a foreign person, it's not subject to impost. So once the false claim to a power to tax directly under the 16th Amendment goes away, so too does your subjectivity to tax on any source of earnings listed in Section 61. Every single one of those sources is tied to either your right to work or your right to property. Rent, interest, dividends, that's all right to property. Federal government's got no jurisdiction, territorial legislation, to inject itself on those revenues and tax them as though it's direct. That was all a constitutional fraud, as is the tax brackets. Tax brackets are a constitutional fraud because it's not uniform. Class legislation is communistic, not constitutional. You can't break the people into different classes, poor, middle class, and wealthy, and then write different tax law, different rates of tax for each of the different classes, and tax them at different rates. That's unconstitutional. It's discriminatory. Tax brackets are based on the power of Congress to discriminate against the articles of commerce and commodities subject to tax and against the corporate person, the foreign person, and the licensed person. The corporate is not a real person. The basis for the discrimination can be Congress's power to tax at different rates depending upon the level of earnings enjoyed as a function of the privilege enjoyed, or a level of earnings that are earned as a function of the privilege of incorporation or of being licensed or of handling ATF materials. But what power does Congress have to discriminate against the American people on the basis of wealth or income? None. None. And the government justifies this by saying it's not intrinsic uniformity that's necessary, but geographical uniformity. But geographical uniformity was the argument that was applied at a time when it was inconceivable that there would be direct taxation of the revenues of the people. So they're talking only about the corporate person, the licensed person, and the foreign person, whom Congress can discriminate against. And the geographical uniformity argument says that as long as the people in the 50 states, each of the 50 states, are treated uniformly within each bracket, or rather persons, because it's not people, as long as the persons in each bracket are treated the same in each state, geographical uniformity is okay. So you can treat corporations that earn $1 million, you can give them a higher tax rate than corporations that earn only $10,000. And that's perfectly okay as long as each group of corporations is treated exactly the same in each and every state. Well, now what happens if we extend that theoretical geographical uniformity to citizens? Would it then be okay to tax Jews at 90% and Christians at 10%, blacks at 5% and whites at 95%, the old at 40%, the young at 90%, men at 80%, women at 20%? Would any of that be okay? Well, as long as you treat each group the same in all 50 states under the theory of geographical uniformity, every single bit of it is perfectly okay, which is nonsense. Constitutional nonsense. Geographical uniformity doesn't apply to citizens. I think I hear the second commercial break coming up. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. Get tuned in, become a member, and get over to taxfreedom.com and start getting educated. Yo. Okay, this is Thomas Fried on the Liberty Works Radio Network. I'm just going to get right back into this here for the last segment. So, as I was saying when the commercial break came up, it's not a constitutional system anymore. It's a complete and total constitutional fraud. It's a communistic system. Why do I say communistic? Well, because it's the second plank of the Communist Manifesto, where you find both income tax and graduated taxation. Literally, the second plank reads a heavy, progressive, or graduated income tax. That's where you find the class warfare of class legislation utilizing graduated tax brackets to divide the people and keep them fighting amongst themselves. So the Politburo, the socialist elites, can rule them instead of being forced to represent the whole. The different tax rates make sure that no politician can ever represent the whole people, because you either represent one side and a low tax rate for your people and a higher tax rate on the other class, or vice versa. It's impossible to advocate for the whole people because you can't advocate for the same tax rate without being attacked by your own party. And of course, it's an unfixable problem. You can't have a flat tax that taxes everyone directly at the same rate, the same way you can't have a graduated tax. So it's unconstitutional because it's not direct. It's unconstitutional because it's not uniform. And it's unconstitutional because they have been enforcing it. It's unconstitutional in operational practice since basically 1955, because it's not a non-apportioned direct tax. One of the things the Supreme Court also reiterates from 1916 in Bershaber, it reiterates in Moore that direct taxes, without exception, all direct taxes, must still be apportioned to the several states for payment in proportion to their share of the last census. Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4 are the two unrepealed, unamended provisions, clauses of the original Constitution limiting all direct taxation, which are still in full force and effect on all and for all direct taxes. So it's constitutionally impossible, according to the Supreme Court, for there to have ever been a non-apportioned direct tax. And without a direct tax, it can't be in the 50 states on all persons. It can only be on persons subject to indirect taxation by impost, duty, or excise. There's no authority to tax the labor, the work, the earnings, the revenue, or the income of the American people. It does not exist under the Constitution. The statutes that have been judicially rewritten through interpretive opinion, which opinion applies and enforces that second plank of the Communist Manifesto, not the constitutional limitations imposed on all federal taxation, whether direct, which must be apportioned and can never be collected or demanded from the individual citizens. They're prohibited from demanding you pay a direct tax, which has been the basis of them stealing the money from you since 1955. 1980, informal precedent of the circuit courts, who don't cite any actual language from Gershaber. They just proclaim this is what the court declared, direct non-apportioned tax. That's the argument they rejected. The only way to get to the opposite conclusion is to decide you're going to enforce socialism and communism under the second plank instead of the constitutional limitation in order to empower the federal government beyond what is authorized and enable them, through the bureaucratic regulatory deference provided by Chevron, for the bureaucrats, the agencies, to write their own laws to rule every aspect of American life, which is what they've done with the EPA, with OSHA, with the IRS. All of these are being done through regulations that go beyond the language of the statute. And the courts have allowed it to occur through regulatory deference, which has basically let the agencies write their own laws through regulations that justify, under the regulation, them breaking the law as provided by Congress in statute. That's a coup. That's a rebellion inside the government. That's sedition that the courts rubber stamped. And it took, 60 years for this court to throw away regulatory deference under the Chevron doctrine through their decision in Loper-Bright, which says you can no longer do that. Everybody's limited by the law, including the agencies and the courts, and from now on, in examining an issue, you can't make your conclusion based on regulatory deference. You have to go to the statute and justify the regulation from what is actually written in the statute. So when they say it's not direct, they expose the unconstitutional nature of the whole system. It's not direct. It's never been a non-apportioned direct tax. It's never been a tax without limitation. It's always been a tax that is okay to be without apportionment because it's not direct. It's indirect, and indirect taxes aren't required to be apportioned. They're only required to be uniform, which, when enforced on citizens, the graduated tax is not uniform. But if you go to geographical uniformity, well, then you've gotten rid of the intrinsic uniformity, but now you've opened the door to taxing blacks different from whites, old different from young, male different from female, Christian different from Jew or Islam or Hindu or Buddhist. They could all be taxed differently. And according to geographical uniformity, that would be perfectly fine. As long as all the Islamics are taxed at 100% in all 50 states, it's okay to tax the Christians, the Jews, the Hindus, the Buddhists at 5% and let the burden of the tax fall only on the Islamics. And that way, hopefully, they'll all leave the country, right? And it's perfectly okay under geographical uniformity to do that. Now, what do you think? Is that constitutionally okay? Anyone who argues it, I say you're an idiot. You're an idiot. It's obviously not constitutional. Congress can't write law that treats the young different from the old, the male different from the female, the gay different from the straight, the Italian different from the Irish, the Jew different from the Christian, the black different from the white, the Indian different from the Chinese. These laws are unconstitutional. The whole tax system is unconstitutionally communistic. This is how the government has assumed all this ungranted power. Where is climate in the Constitution? Where is energy? Where is education? Where is health care? Where is housing? Where are any of these things in the Constitution? They're not there. These are areas the government is not granted to exercise legislation, and it shouldn't be spending money there. All of these unauthorized agencies should be abolished. Their budget should be cut across the board 10%, and the money divided to the states proportionate to the census, so that the states can administer to the environment, the energy, the agriculture, the housing, the health care. This should be state money spent from 50 different state capitals in each state, not all money spent by the federal government only in Washington, D.C. This should be distributed economy, not monopolized rule from one city. How much money does D.C. need? There's no agriculture or energy. Yeah, they've got housing problems. But agriculture and energy, what do they know about energy in Texas as opposed to Maine? This is all just insane. To let the government keep growing and growing, and agency after agency assuming more and more authority, both territorial and legislatively, where none of it is granted. And pretty soon you're a ruled people who were robbed and enslaved and given no escape, because if you object, they take your home and kick you into the wilderness to die with the wolves and the highway robbers. The income tax is the second plank of the Communist Manifesto, and its sedition, perpetrated through the IRS, the DOJ, and the federal courts for the last 60 years, is the reason why America is where it's at today. Divided, $37 trillion in debt, with an enslaved people who don't know the Constitution, their own history, or the limits of authority imposed on the government by the Constitution. Now, the Supreme Court has opened the door to terminating all of this fraud and unconstitutional nonsense with its reassertion in Moore that income taxes are indirect, not direct, and that all direct taxes must be apportioned to the states, meaning they can't be enforced in the courts against individual citizens. So the government can't argue it's a direct tax anymore. And they also can't find any arguable basis for claiming you owe tax on your wages because of an impost on foreign activity, a duty on exported goods, or an excise on commodities, licenses, or corporations. There's no basis to tax your work anymore. What needs to be done is the income tax should be repealed in its entirety, both personal and corporate, because the corporate income tax allows the corporations to deduct all their expenses, losses, capital equivalent, and there's no profit to pay tax. So the corporations avoid tax through accounting, and that compels the entire burden of the system to be shifted to the backs of labor, who were never intended to be the subjects of federal taxation. It's the corporations and the foreigners and the licensed persons who are the subjects of the federal government, whose activity in the 50 states is under their jurisdiction legislatively and can be taxed by the excise power. But citizens don't earn money through a privilege granted to them by the government, like in corporation. They earn money by God-given right. You have a right to work. You have a right to private property. You have a right to work hard at legal activities of your own choosing, and to accumulate property as a result of accumulating the fruits of your own labor without federal interference or direct taxation. You're only subject to tax on the specific activities and transactions you engage in that are subject to some impost, duty, or excise, which don't reach the domestic activities of citizens in the 50 states. All of this is recorded. in the original legislation and in the 1939 statutes at large, and all of it is available as documents that you can download and view at taxfreedom.com. All of this information is there. I can't do everything. I need people's help spreading awareness of this fraud. It's all exposed, and we can terminate the system. I just need a little help. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. I'm pretty sure I hear the music coming up. We'll be back next week with more on More.